Our next speaker will be Marius, developer advocate for SAP BTP and SAP UI technologies. He will be discussing the topics of web apps on SAP BTP 101.
You already heard it, a developer advocate here at SAP. And in that job role, I cover topics of front-end development and cloud-native development. And before I did that role, or I took that role, I was a UI developer doing SAP UI5 development. And I also did some coding with React in my spare time. So I'm happy that I'm able to speak here. But I was also a little bit concerned because honestly, I think all of you are probably more familiar with fundamental library, UX design, and also probably other frameworks such as React or Vue. So I wasn't sure what I should talk about here today. But then I thought maybe you all know all these open source frameworks, but maybe you don't know SAP BTP, SAP's cloud platform. And that should be a good opportunity for me to tell you more about the platform and why you could use it or should use it, and why maybe talk a little bit about the scenarios where it doesn't make much sense to use it, so that you really understand the advantages of this platform. And for that, I have the following agenda here. So first, let's talk about platforms where you could host your fundamental apps in theory. Then I show you some services that are crucial for hosting web applications on SAP BTP. And then we'll come to a live demo in which I will basically show you live how to deploy a React or fundamental React application to SAP BTP in a very cost-efficient way. So let's dive right into the start with platforms where you could run your fundamental apps on. Here are a few logos of companies, technologies, frameworks that are out there. And it's obviously not a complete list. It was really easy to come up with this list, I think, in 5 minutes. And that shows how many options there are for you when you are a front-end developer. You could say, and it's not even like one or the other, you could almost freely combine any of these technologies. Let's say you build an application and you have your static files, your dist folder. Do you want to expose this dist folder behind an Nginx server? Maybe you want to put it behind in an Express application, embed it in there. Or you just distribute it on Bursal to have it like on a CDN worldwide available. Or if you have let's say you do the Express application approach, you could either push it directly to Heroku, Cloud Foundry, to Azure App Services, or you wrap it one more time in a Docker container and run it on Kubernetes. And when you run it on Kubernetes, do you host a cluster yourself? Do you render it on AWS and GCP, or go to Azure for that route? So you see there are many options. So it obviously, now the question is, what is the best option for you and for your application? Well, it depends, right? You probably hear the sentence very often, but most of the time it is actually true, and it depends on the requirements that you have. So I would assume that when you use fundamental library, that you want to build a Fiori application because it is an application that is used in the enterprise context somehow. So it's probably a business application that displays data from a business system. That could be an SAP system, could be a third-party system. It could be an extension or custom development on NetWeaver stack, for example. So there are obviously many variables, but I think as you're participating in this conference and as you're most likely developing a business application, I should explain you why SAP BTP might be a good choice for that type of applications. And one reason might be that you want to use the same users that you use in your other business applications, so that you have the same identity provider in the background. It could be SAP's identity provider, the IaaS system. It could be an Azure AD system that you connect to the SAP BTP platform, and that allows you to do SSO, for example, when you log in. Or you want to display business data coming from an SAP S4 system in the cloud, or it could be an S4 system on-premise, or even older systems on-premise. So displaying business data is probably also something that you want to do, or integrating it with workflows. So either your application is triggered by a workflow or your application triggers a workflow. So these could all be requirements that you have that make sense then to run the application entirely on SAP BTP in contrast to just integrating the parts where you need to make HTTP requests, for example. So let's talk about what SAP BTP is in the context of UI development. So for this, I would say you need to know at least these three services that you see on the slide here. The first one, the user account and authentication service, short UAA, sometimes also referred to access UAA service, is a service that helps you to make sure that only authenticated users are able to access your web application. And when you use the service to make sure only authenticated users access the web application, this service also provides you some data about the users when they use it, for example, like first name, last name, email address, like all the roles that are assigned to this user. So all that stuff is taken care of for you by the UAA service. The second service that is really nice to have, or even important, is the HTML5 application repository. And this is basically a file-level abstraction, if you want, where you can store your static files of your web application, which means your index.html file, your CSS files, your JavaScript bundles, all that stuff can be stored in the HTML5 application repository. And having it in a central place on this cloud platform has the advantage that you can reference it from multiple places. You can reference it from multiple applications that maybe use the same UI. If you build a micro front end, or it also makes it easy if you have a Fiori application to integrate it in, for example, the Fiori Launchpad without doing a lot of wiring, because then you could just point the Fiori Launchpad to this HTML5 application repository, and it will pull all the information it needs automatically. And the last service here on the slide is the destination service. And this one can be really useful, for example, if you want to connect to any kind of web endpoint or web interface. That might be an SAP system that you have on-premise and connected through an HTTP tunnel to the cloud. It might be a third-party API that uses OAuth. So, and if you use the third-party API, obviously authentication is different than for an SAP system. For an SAP system, you might want to convert your cloud user to an on-premise user. For OAuth, you want to do a token exchange, possibly. And all these different authentication questions are basically abstracted away for you from the destination service. So the only thing you need to handle on an application development level is just that you reference the name of the destination that you want to connect to. And with these three services, you can build a lot of applications. So let's see this a little bit more in action, how you would use these services in your application. And for that, I got this chart here that you can see. It basically shows you the SAP BTP box and a sub-account within that box. And this sub-account is basically where you create your development artifacts. And from the outside, there are the application clients. Could be mobile devices, could be desktops, could be laptops, could be actually any device from which your users can send HTTP requests to your application or to your application router. And this application router is just an application like any other application on the web. So it has a URL, you access it, and then it sends requests to it. And the app router will basically then act as a reverse proxy. So for example, the login related requests and redirects will be sent to the UAA service. The requests to static files, such as the index.html or the CSS files or the JavaScript bundles, they will be forwarded to the HTML5 application repository. And all other requests, where, for example, request SAP data, will be sent to the destination service. And from there, it might go through a cloud connector, it might go any other route, but that's not your concern as an application developer. You just say, I want to have a connection to the destination service, and this is a destination I want to send my requests to, and the rest will be taken care of for you. The configuration of this app router looks like this here. So basically you have a file that is, what is it, like 18 lines big, and it is in a certain location. So if you look above the number 1, where the lines are counted, you see this string standalone app router, blah, 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 hello world. This is the name of the project. Obviously, you could pick a shorter name for your project. And then you have another directory called router. This is where the application router is defined with the package.json, as it's a Node.js application, and the configuration of this application app router. And the configuration file is always called access_app.json. And the file itself has different keywords. For example, this authentication method is a keyword. If you set it to route, that's a keyword that it should use the access UAA service. So the app router relies on a service binding to the access UAA service. And in the first route, so line 5 to line 9, you basically see that all traffic that starts with -v2- will be redirected to a destination of the name northwind. And this tells the app router there has to be a service binding to the destination service. And in the second route, similarly, it basically takes all traffic that is remaining. So this is a regex that matches anything, and it will send this traffic to the HTML5 application repository. And so the app router also knows there has to be a binding to that service. And if the app router has these 3 bindings, it will start, it will do its job. And if one binding is missing, it will crash during the startup. So you will notice immediately. And this is option 1. This is the most simple option, I would say. This is also an option you can easily test locally, but there is a more powerful option for you. And this option basically is shown here. It looks almost the same, but this time you won't have an app router that is in the sub account, but you have a Launchpad subscription, which is a subscription to the SAP Launchpad service, for example. And this subscription will basically replace the app router that otherwise would be managed by you. But as the subscription is managed by SAP, we also call this the managed app router. And you won't have to do the wiring as explicitly as for the app router. You just have to do some metadata keywords I will show you later to basically establish the connection between the services and the Launchpad subscription. And once that's set up, it just works and you won't have to do anything. Whereas you have to do one small thing, let's say, you still have to have some configuration where you define the routes. It seems that I cannot advance the slides. Let me try again. Okay, can someone advance the slide for me, please? Okay, perfect, thank you. And so what you see here is a file that almost looks the same as what you've seen before, with one small difference. So if you look at the the second row, where we see the name of the project, now this access_app.json file is not in the app router directory, but it's in the HTML5 module directory. And this kind of makes sense because there is no app router. So you have to put this configuration somewhere else. And in this case, we just put it in a directory where the rest of the web application lives. For example, the index.html file is also in here. So, and that's the only difference. Obviously, in the welcome file, the relative path to the file changes as well as we change the location of this access_app.json file. But besides this, it's the exactly same file, just put in a different place. And let me try to take control again here. Okay, now it seems that I can advance the slides again. Perfect. So here are some differences between the managed app router and the standalone app router approach. I also wrote a blog post that I linked in the second last slide. And I want to skip the first 2 points here and just focus on the third point and the following ones. So I already mentioned it. If you use the managed approach and you store the applications fully in the application repository, the SAP Launchpad service is already aware of these applications, and you can just check them, check a checkbox, and confirm that you want to add this application to Fiori Launchpad, for example. I should say that this currently is something that's limited to SAP UI5 applications, but it doesn't mean that only SAP UI5 applications can use the managed app router. This only affects the integration in the Fiori Launchpad. What will also be taken care for you in the managed approach is the scaling. If you use the standalone approach, that means that you have to basically make sure that there's enough CPU assigned to your application, that there's enough memory assigned, and you have to scale it up or scale it out when you're reaching, when the resources are getting smaller or reduced more. And obviously this leads to a higher total cost of ownership because you need to manage it, someone needs to manage it, and you need to pay for the resources. Whereas with the managed approach, SAP manages it for you, and you don't have to do the scaling work, and you don't have to pay more if more people use it. And obviously deployments are also faster with the managed approach because you have to deploy less components. You effectively just replace some files in this file level abstraction, the application repository, but you don't have to stop an application, make a new build of a container or droplet and push it and wait until it's started. You just replace the files, and then the app router the managed app router will pick it up automatically for you. And with that, I would say, let's jump to the presentation, and fingers crossed, let's hope everything works. So let me start to share my screen here. Perfect. So let's make it a little bit, move that over here. I hope the font size is large enough. And here I prepared a small project to save some time. So basically this is a project template that you can find also linked. There's a link to GitHub also in the next slide that you will see later on. And there is this mta.yaml that basically defines a couple of modules and the resources. And the resources are basically service instances. So you know the destination service, I already introduced it to the application repository service and the UAA service. So these services are defined here. And in the modules, we basically define this, some destinations that are created. This is what I hinted earlier, that you need to have certain destinations to connect the managed app router with the services. So this is what happens here. And then you have a deployer, and the deployer basically deploys whatever zip folder is in, whatever files are in the zip folder here. And over here, you see a plain React application that I created with create React app, just to save some time on the npm install. So if I run it now here, you'll notice that I didn't do anything on this project besides creating it. So it's not using fundamental React yet, and it's not optimized for SAP BTP. That's all stuff that we're going to do now here. So here you see the create React app is basically creating this simple page that you can see here. And the first thing that we're going to do now is to install, create a darn add fundamental React. And once that's installed, we can basically open the app.js file. Let's open the app.js file here and add a new import statement to use one of the components that's available in fundamental React. And let's use I think I have a cheat sheet somewhere here. Yeah, let's use this message strip. And then here in the renderer, we just add one surrounding div. so that we can add a second element here. And he would just say, hello, this is a demo. And once I saved the file, let's go over to our React application that obviously I stopped, so I have to start it again. And it's starting the development server, and then it's refreshing the page here all by itself. And once it's done, if I scroll down, I see, hello, this is a live demo. You'll notice that this is not using any state right now. So let's change it to the message strip to be of type success. Let's do that here. And save it. And then when we go back over to the application, it should be green, but you'll notice the icon is missing and it's using the wrong font. And this is something that you have to add manually in React applications if you use fundamental React. But it's not hard to do, so let's do that briefly here. I'll show you what you got to do. And you open the dependencies in the package.json, just drop this SAP theming dependency. That's also the dependency Peter mentioned in the keynote earlier, if you watched that as well. And that theming dependency basically contains all the fonts that are needed and the icons. And then we just add a post install script that basically moves the dependencies, this font, or copies the font from this dependency to the source folder. So if I stop this now here and I say yarn install, save the file. So I call yarn install. And if I then run the application again, we should be able to see that this icon is visible. Let's wait a moment. Oh, obviously I forgot one step that's important. So if I go to the CSS, I have to add CSS to actually use the fonts that I just added there. Yeah. So now that I added the CSS, here you see the icon, there is a small tick. Maybe let me zoom in so that you can actually see it. Nice. And now there's only one step actually missing to deploy the application to SAP BTP. And for that, I have to add this one more modification to the package.json, add this homepage tag. This is a React thing that basically influences how the index.html file will reference the JavaScript bundles. And let's modify the build script. We still continue to use this React script build, but once that's done, we basically create a zip folder, because remember when we had a look at the mta.yaml, there we said that there has to be a zip folder with this name in this module, in this folder here. And once that's done, let's do two other small modifications to the files that you see here. So one is that we have to add some properties to the manifest.json so that the managed app router knows what the name of this application is. And obviously, we spoke about that before, we have to add the access app.json file that basically includes all the routing information. But here we basically just say there is only one route, and this route basically says all the files are included in the application repository. And then we just briefly run mbt build. Obviously, we have to run this from the project root. So on this level here, execute it. And when mbt build runs, it basically calls create React app build or React scripts build. This might take a second or two, depending on how complex your React application is. But as I didn't do much here, that should be fairly fast. Okay, that's finished here now. And then we see that this MTA archive is created, and this is the deployment unit. So here I can just do cf deploy reference this file, and then I say deploy this entire application to SAP BTP. It might take a second or two as it needs to upload the entire file, and then it makes sure are the services there. So is there a UAA service? Is there a destination service? Is there an HTML5 application repository service? And then it creates the service keys based on the services, creates destinations for you, and it uploads the application. And you don't have to remember every step that I just said, what's happening. What's important is that it basically translates these like 90 lines of code where you define the configuration. It translates this into instructions and executes it on SAP BTP. And once it's done, or you can watch how it's progressing during this time. So for example, here told me the service already exists, and then it creates service keys, writes destinations, uploads the content, and then last but not least, it finished. So the process finished, which is good in our case. So if I go over here and I refresh the page, you see that I'm being redirected to a log on page, to the authentication page. It logs me on via SSO. And then when I scroll down here, I see the basic create React application with our message script that we added. So perfect, that worked just in time. Let me go back to my slides. And here are the slides that I already promised to you, with some links to blog posts that explain more in detail what I just did, how to host non-UI5 applications in the application repository, which means React applications, but it could as well be an Angular or Vue or any other application. The only thing that you need to do in the end is to basically convert your dist folder to a zip file, and then it just uploads these resources. And this link to GitHub basically shows you the samples that I used in the presentation as well as in the demo. And in the end, you have some tutorials that you can do if you want to learn more. And with that, took a little bit longer than I expected, but I think I finished more or less on time. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, if you have questions, let me know now, or if you think about this, or maybe you watch the replay and you have questions later, just hit me up on Twitter, in the SAP community, or send me an email. Thanks.